I ended the last presentation suggesting that effectively addressing global poverty should be a moral priority for Christians and all people of goodwill. I suggested that Christians, their denominations, and their local churches should become better educated about the reality of global poverty and its causes. Christians should provide more, I insisted, for emergency relief and encourage their governments to do the same. We should provide more development assistance to enable people to provide for themselves. Finally, we should be advocates for economic justice, demanding those reforms that are necessary to eliminate the reality of poverty.
Of course, the truth of the matter is that very often global poverty is not a moral priority for Christians or for other people who think of themselves as people of goodwill. Why is that? Why do we struggle to make poverty, particularly global poverty, a moral priority? One of the books that has profoundly shaped my own thinking is a book by a recently deceased Christian scholar named Marcus Borg. In his book, The Heart of Christianity, he makes the argument that social transformation from injustice to justice is a major part of the promise of God to us, and that a major moral obligation laid on us from a Christian perspective is the obligation to seek justice. Yet he too acknowledges that many Christians don't make justice a priority. Just as I'm saying, many don't make addressing the needs of the poor a priority. He suggests three reasons for that. First, he says, we live in a society that is profoundly individualistic. We tend to think of of the promises of God to us in terms of the salvation of my individual soul, not the transformation of our community. We tend to think about what our individual obligations are to other individuals, not how we together shape the policies and practices of institutions. That individualism means it's difficult for us to even think about issues of justice. The second, more troubling reason even that Borg mentions is the fact that the church, since the Roman Emperor Constantine became converted to Christianity in 313, since that time, the church has largely been closely connected to and affiliated with the great centers of power in the Western world. Borg's argument is that because of that, the Christian community sees itself or experiences itself as a part of the power structure, and therefore tends to make it insensitive to or unaware of the way in which that power structure creates injustice and poverty for others. Does the church, do Christians, as Borg suggests, see themselves as part of the status quo, benefiting from that status quo, and therefore does that make us insensitive to the problems, the way things are, causes to others? Finally, he says we often tend not to think about justice as Christians because we believe there's a conflict between God's mercy or God's forgiveness and God's justice. We tend to no longer see God as a God of justice, but to see God as a God of love, forgiveness, and mercy. You will recall, I think, that when I discussed the principle of love, I argued that it's not, in fact, in conflict with justice, that justice refers to love's expression in an institutional context. But I acknowledge there that often Christians think there is a conflict between love and justice, and Borg's point is we focus on love and forget about it. Let me suggest some other reasons why Christians often fail to make poverty a moral priority. One of the things that I have often heard Christians say is that, in one way or another, that poverty really doesn't matter. I've heard people say, look, poor people can be very happy, and often are. And many times people go on mission trips, for example, to poor parts of the world and come back saying, gee, it's amazing, they were so poor, and yet they were so happy. The danger there is that because they seem happy to us, despite their poverty, maybe addressing their poverty is not that important. Sometimes you will hear people say, well, the important thing is to have a good relationship to God, not to have a lot of stuff. It's always people who have a lot of stuff that say that. The important thing is to have a good relationship to God, no matter how much or how little stuff you have. And poor people often have a very profound faith in God. Therefore, poverty is not that big a problem. And related to all that is the idea that our hope as human beings is for heaven, a spiritual reality. Our hope is not in this world and its physical realities, of which poverty is a part. All of that to say, poverty is really not a moral crisis, a theological crisis. Poverty is really not something that calls for a profound response on our part. Another thing that Christians often say that undermines their sense of obligation to respond to poverty as a moral priority is that poverty is not the result of anything we or those who are not poor have done. It's caused mostly by the misfortune of others for which no one is responsible. It's caused by the bad choices that poor people have made. It's generally not the result of injustice on the part of us or those who are not poor. So Christians fall into the same misunderstanding, I think, that non-Christians often fall into, that would suggest unless poverty is the result of injustice, I'm really not that obligated to respond. Now, surely I would agree that if poverty is the result of injustice, our obligation to respond intensifies. But I have suggested that from a Christian worldview, it does not matter what causes poverty. We still, as people of love, have an obligation to respond. Another reason I think that Christians often fail to respond to the reality of poverty is the belief that somehow we who are not poor are not really affected by the poverty of others. Our lives are not diminished. Our lives are not undermined. And of course, to the degree all of us, even those of us who are Christians, are still focused on ourselves and our own welfare, poverty seems not to be a problem. Maybe we say, there, but for the grace of God, go I, when we see a poor person. We're thankful we're not poor. But we don't really see our own lives as affected by poverty, and therefore we are slow to respond. A final reason that I would point to for our failure to make poverty a priority is that we tend to become focused on other issues, on other moral challenges, and make those a priority ahead of addressing global poverty. For conservative Christians, if you will, issues like sexual immorality and abortion seem to be more important than global poverty. For those on the left, you might say, or progressive Christians, liberal Christians, issues of war and peace and issues related to the oppression of LGBT people tend to get our attention much more than global poverty. In all of this, I think there is a tendency among church people, and maybe this is the most significant explanation for our failure to make global poverty a priority for us. So much, it seems just so big. and so beyond our ability to influence. And it requires us to talk about things that are controversial once we have to start to think about the policies and practices that might have to be changed to address global poverty. So because the problem is so big, and because it requires us to engage ourselves in matters about which there is bound to be controversy, we simply go about our business with our moral attention focused elsewhere, rather than on the reality of global poverty. Well, of course, I think all that's a mistake. I think addressing global poverty should be a moral priority for those who are Christians, indeed for all people of goodwill. Why would I say that? Because a serious reading of the Old and New Testaments suggests that it is a priority for God. The fact that the God of the Bible is a God of mercy and forgiveness in no way undermines God's commitment to the poor and the responsibility for the poor that the God of the Bible has laid upon us. I would also say that, in fact, our lives will be better if we address the needs of the poor and reduce inequality. Our happiness, our flourishing, our well-being as human beings depends upon the quality of our relationship with others. We have a stake in responding to the needs of the poor. As the just peacemaking paradigm suggested, where inequality and injustice is reduced, violence and conflict and war are reduced as possibilities in our lives. Where poverty and inequality are addressed and reduced, social tensions are undermined, and we all enjoy a better relationship to all the people in our community. I would also say that the reality of global poverty is partly grounded in injustice. In injustice that benefits us. Our wealth is in significant measure at the expense of those who are poor. Our wealth has been made possible by the capacity that our governments and the corporations with which we are familiar have for exploiting the resources of the third world, of the developing nations. We benefit from that. But those who live in those countries are often made poor, or the likelihood that they will be poor is increased because of that exploitation. We have a responsibility to undermine that situation of injustice that produces our wealth and their poverty. I would insist addressing global poverty must be a moral priority for those who are not poor, Christian and otherwise. Well, in future presentations, we will look at some suggestions about what we can do to effectively address global poverty.